22 of Bram Stoker, chapter 22 of Bram Stoker's Dracula. So let's have a brief look at what happens in this particular chapter. Mina rejoins the group. The men manage to destroy Dracula's lair at Carfax, and then they're going to break into the Piccadilly house and discover that one of his boxes is missing. So what we have here is Jonathan Harker's dated the 3rd of October, and only his journal. So his journal is the whole chapter. And he feels almost compelled to either write in his journal or go mad after hearing Mina's story. Remember, Dracula forced her to drink his blood, and Jonathan wants to stay with his wife, but he can't. And he realizes that because it's daytime, obviously he can leave her alone. So there's no danger to her. Interestingly, the theme of religion is certainly important too, because it talks about in trouble and trial our faith is tested. So this chapter also draws attention to the idea that religious people feel, or people of the Christian faith believe, that trials and trouble are there for testing processes, and that everyone must battle these. But interestingly, it's also important to note that Jonathan is not as strong in his faith as his wife Mina is. So Mina is now the main reason for the group's urgent action against Dracula. Previously, obviously, they were motivated by a sense of duty. They were protecting the innocent from the enemy, but they didn't really know the innocent. They didn't know them personally. But now Mina has become a concrete, tangible symbol. And this is what, therefore, they are all fighting for. Even Seward and Arthur has seen their desperate need to avenge Lucy seems to have been superseded by their need to protect Mina. So, and this is all very likely to the fact that, again, she is there. She is a constant reminder. So this section of the novel could really be considered the counter-attack section, and is certainly marked by the men going on to the trail of the vampire. Okay. We also learn that Renfield's death will not be investigated and has actually been recorded as death by misadventure. Interestingly, they haven't put the true cause of his death on the death certificate, because they are very well aware no one would believe what really happened anyway. So Mina gets the chance to rejoin the group, and of course they decide that there must be no more concealment, and that of course is the ironic, because she's the one who will land up concealing things from them. Okay, so she also says, because if I find in myself, and I shall watch keenly for it, a sign of harm to any that I love, I shall die. So when Van Helsing suggests that Mina might be a threat to the others, she states that she would clearly rather die than hurt those she loves. So she is very well aware of the implications of having been joined to Dracula through bloodletting. Van Helsing tells her that it doesn't matter, she's got to stay alive, because if she does die now, she will become what they refer to as the quick undead. Mina, of course, now once more becomes the secretary. Van Helsing takes up the role of the leader, and I think that's almost natural progression, because of course he is older than the other men. They're all in their late 20s, early 30s, and he will be quite a bit older, probably in his 40s or 50s, and therefore it's natural that they bow to his knowledge. But also he is very knowledgeable, and he's the only one who has been through the experience before. So he informs them, obviously, because of his experience and because of his understanding of the situation. He tells everyone that they need to destroy the Dracula's lair and sterilize them. Please note the word lair is the same word that we tend to use to den. Okay. Jonathan, interestingly enough, is very impatient. He's even prepared to break the law. Which is quite interesting, and gives us insight into Jonathan's character, because he is one of those sticklers who likes to stick to the rules. But here he is so impatient that he's happy to break into Dracula's home. But Van Helsing obviously says that perhaps using a locksmith would be a far better idea, because of course then they are showing discretion, and Dracula would not even know that they had been into the house, whereas if they break down the door or break in, they will clearly leave signs of this, and therefore Dracula will be aware that they are onto him. Obviously there is the idea that he will know because of Mina, but remember, during daylight hours he and Mina are not in communication, because of course he's unable to function in daylight hours, and he's recuperating. So the men are about to leave, and Van Helsing obviously has to make sure that Mina is very well guarded. And what he does is he places a communion wafer on her forehead. Okay. And of course, the result is that she is burnt. This wafer produces a mark of shame. She's got this. She screams a fearful scream as soon as he puts the wafer on her forehead, and it burns into her flesh. And it's this mark of shame on her forehead. And of course, the significance is, again, she's unclean, which is repetition of her chant in the previous chapter, and echoing again the idea of lack of cleanliness and the allusion to lepers in the time of Christ, who would have to announce that they were unclean. The reason that this is so important, this mark of shame, is because it links her to Dracula. So we need to look at this in two ways here. We've got the fact that the devil mark is reminiscent of the Antichrist. So biblically in Revelation, when the devil takes over, or the Antichrist arrives and everyone starts to support him, they will be marked and it's the number is 666, and the idea is they will be marked on the forehead. I don't think it's literally going to be 666 tattooed on the forehead, but I'm not a theologian, so I actually shouldn't really comment there. But it's the idea that she's been marked by the devil. Also, if you recall, in chapter 3, Jonathan hit Dracula right at the beginning, hit Dracula on the forehead with a spade and left a gouge or a mark on his forehead. So now Dracula and Mina have matching marks. So perhaps Stoker is trying to suggest that there is very little difference between the hero and the villain. Both have Mina, Dracula in the spiritual sense, and of course Jonathan as her husband. But also it prepares us for understanding later why Mina does pity Dracula. The fact that she's able to forgive this monster who destroyed her best friend and almost annihilates her own happiness, again reminds us that Mina is almost saint-like, and we are constantly reminded of how different she was to Lucy. Again, it is important to note that it's clearly in moments of crisis Van Helsing becomes the group's spiritual guide and their leader. Obviously, he is the man in this text, throughout the text, who's been the most vocal about his faith and his beliefs. And when in doubt, the others seem to turn to him for support. So maybe Stoker is portraying him in almost priest-like role. He's a priest-like figure. Interestingly, when they talk about praying for before they go out, it says in the text, then without a word we all knelt down together and all holding hands swore to be true to each other. We men pledged ourselves to raise the veil of sorrow from the head of her whom each in his own way we loved, and we pray for help and guidance. So they're kneeling, they kiss his hand, he becomes almost pope-like, and of course they pray for guidance. This just demonstrates the loyalty to one another. Again, a Victorian audience would have a very different reaction to this. It would not seem unusual, whereas a modern audience might think this a little bit odd, this behavior. So the men managed to destroy Carfax, and then they head off to London. And it's at this time when, of course, Arthur's title and influence come into its own. He's able to persuade a locksmith to open up the house of Piccadilly, and they enter. And it's once they go in, and they're completely overwhelmed by the sense of smell, which we will look at now. And it is when they manage to break in that they realize there are only 8 boxes. So Jonathan tells us he has written, up until now, he's written all of this on the train. And we have a change now, because it's Piccadilly, 12:30 o'clock, just before we reach Fenchurch Street. Lord Godalming said to me, Quincy and I will find a locksmith. So it's the idea that they are going to gain entrance to Piccadilly, and again they're going to try and be discreet about it. Note how Arthur, or Lord Godalming, seems to remain in the background and only comes forward when he's needed. He's not a central character. We don't hear from him. He is an English aristocrat. We do need to remind ourselves of this. His name is Arthur, and of course that draws on legend, and makes us think of Arthur, King Arthur. So he is associated with the ideas of chivalry and magic, and maybe, and some have even suggested that, of course, his name, Arthur Godalming, is very similar to the idea of Lord God Almighty. So he is kind of he's the antithesis of Dracula. Dracula is this cruel despot, and Arthur is this benevolent member of upper class, and will only ever take advantage of his social position when it's helping the group advance. So, for example, he only ever uses his title to do things like encourage locksmiths to help them break in. Remember, Arthur is obviously the man that Lucy chooses to marry, and of course he is a man, we consider him a man of duty and his word. If you recall, at the time when Lucy was suffering, the devoted son had returned to look after his ailing father, and therefore asked Seward to step in and look after Lucy. And I think, again, it's a measure of their great friendship and how much faith and trust Seward has in Arthur, that Seward is prepared to do this and look after this woman who did reject him. So there's a great deal of loyalty between the men, and I think the loyalty, it's this loyalty and duty that have them all trusting Van Helsing. And in terms of Arthur trusting Van Helsing and continuing to search for Dracula, even though, of course, he's been left heartbroken by Lucy's death, and even says there is nothing left in the world for Arthur to live for, quote unquote. So Arthur's clearly a very noble defender and contributes wholeheartedly to the tracking down and destruction of Dracula. So he does almost live up to his namesake of Arthur of Camelot. Clearly he's committed to the campaign, and he's very firm in his purpose, and he never gives up, and therefore Stoker sees to reward him at the end of the novel by allowing him to marry again and to be within a very happy marriage, because it's something that he deserves. I spoke just a little while ago about the smell that they experience when they go into the home of Piccadilly. Please remember again that Stoker is using the senses to stimulate the reader. The idea that smell is an important sense, and the fact that we know as soon as they smell something vile, it's the presence of evil, and we spoke about that earlier a few chapters ago. So we've got this idea that whenever they enter an area where Dracula has been living, the stench is vile because evil is present, and that's why they need to go in. They need to go in and they need to sanctify. They need to cleanse the area. So Quincy and Arthur obviously head off to destroy all the other London lairs. So any other property, because remember, of course, Jonathan was his solicitor, so he knows what property he owns, and they go off to destroy those that remain. And of course, this chapter ends setting us up, or the reader up, for the next chapter when they plan to ambush Dracula within his Piccadilly home, which we will be looking at, obviously, in chapter 23. So I think it's important to know that clearly Stoker is creating a traditional Gothic villain, similar to many Gothic villains of the time in early Gothic literature. And again, I think the Count of Otranto is one of these ideas. Among other things, of course, we've got this Dracula being painted as a member of a corrupt aristocracy, a man who persecutes the innocent and the innocent maiden. And I think it could certainly be argued that Stoker has done this and exaggerated this in order that his middle-class readers can perhaps enjoy this a little bit more. So he certainly emphasizes and exaggerates the class struggle. And interestingly, it's important to note that Dracula's heritage is highlighted and constantly referenced, and we are reminded of it in terms, and it's both his dramatic and his philosophical heritage is highlighted. And why? Because of course, if he had been a peasant, the story certainly would not have been half as dramatic.